This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good morning and welcome to the Friday morning break on Teachers Talk Radio with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Sebastian St. John, head teacher of the Falkland Islands Community School. We are discussing schools at the heart of the community.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
If you're listening to this and you're a teacher in the UK, I wonder if you've ever thought about teaching abroad, maybe permanently. Maybe moving yourself and your family somewhere else in the world, or maybe taking a year out or two. I taught in the United States many years ago as part of a teacher exchange program. It was a great adventure. One thing I learned is a chance to look back at education in this country and discover how other people do schools. Since my theme of this show is what's education for, or what schools are for, I was delighted this week to speak to my guest, who's the head teacher of the Falkland Islands Community School. Yes, the Falkland Islands. 18 hours by military flight from this country in the South Atlantic. You might be thinking of the Falkland Islands and remembering the Falkland Islands War if you're a certain age. You might also be associating the Falkland Islands with ice floes and penguins. You'd be right about the penguins, but wrong about the ice floes. You might be thinking it's rather windswept and desolate. You'd also be wrong about that. What I learned from my guest this week is that a school, of course, is a school with the same problems, issues, demands as a school anywhere. And yet, the unique position that the Falkland Islands has gives opportunities not only to look back at the way we do schools and education, but also I think when we hear from my guest this week, it might be possible that you'll be not a little bit envious.
Imagine having your own instructional coach available 24/7. Now you can with the Teaching How-Tos platform. This highly personalised social platform empowers busy teachers to learn and apply evidence-based teaching techniques, either independently, working collaboratively with their peers, or with our new AI assistant. The platform features over 160 visual guides to teaching techniques, designed to help you quickly and easily implement high-impact practices that boost student engagement and improve learning outcomes. Join over 200 institutions worldwide that are elevating their teaching practices with the How-To app. No gurus, just practical support anytime you need it. Interested in finding out more? Visit teachinghowtos.com and register for our next webinar.
Empowering education with Easy for You, where innovation meets accessibility. Our subscription-based offering not only equips schools with cutting-edge devices, but revolutionizes the learning experience by eliminating financial barriers, streamlining support, and embracing technology. We're not just providing tools, we're shaping a future where every student can thrive, unburdened by limitations. Easy for You, transforming education, one device at a time. Find out more at www.easyforyou.school.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Hi teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculum. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps for good. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
And we're back with Teachers Talk Radio, and my guest this week, Sebastian St. John, who is, well, I've talked to some guests a long way away in California and so on. We're talking from the Falkland Islands, 8,000 islands. That is 8,000 miles to the south of us here, with a special resonance to anyone in this country of a certain age, the Falkland Islands, of course. So, Seb, you're the head teacher of the Falkland Islands Community School. And that's the only school on the Falkland Islands. But before we get to talking about your experiences there, you've been there 2 years. What was it like when you first thought, well, I'm going to the Falkland Islands? And how did you come across that as an option?
So I was in a situation that a lot of people are. I was looking for a job, and I was on TES looking for a job. I was a head teacher at the time in the southeast of England. I'd spent my entire 20 plus years in education working in secondary schools in England, and working overseas had been something that I had considered. So I was also looking at those adverts on TEDs, and I just saw it. And a bit like you just said in your intro there, if you're of a certain age, the Falklands have a bit of a connection to people in the UK. I also grew up in Salisbury and Wiltshire and knew Tidworth. So, it was an area where people come to fight in the Falklands. I'm a history teacher as well, so I have an interest in that period of history as well. So it jumped out at me, and that's what initially piqued my interest. And then as I went through the process and obviously did your due diligence and research into the job and the type of role and the type of school it would be, there are a lot of things that were really attractive about coming here. For example, it's a very small community. It's a small school. It's incredibly well resourced. The government, Falkland Islands government, invests an incredible amount of money into education for the people on the islands, battling against budget issues in the UK, and not something that I experience here.
That's
also
interesting.
I think the other big thing, running a school through an Ofsted window post-COVID, with all of the pressures that puts on school leaders, but also any member of staff in the school, the opportunity to come here where it's, although we're a British overseas territory, we're not governed by the UK education policy. So a break from Ofsted and an ability to try and improve the school in a sustainable way at the right speed and at the right time. And then obviously also not being under English schools sort of accountability measures. So being able to offer curriculum, especially at Key Stage 4, that suit the individual pupil, as opposed to only selecting courses that correspond to Progress 8 measures. And so just a bit more flexibility for a head, I suppose, is what it offers.
That sounds like a wonderfully attractive proposition. When you applied to the job, and what was the selection process like?
Well, it's all online. It's an 18-hour flight on a Ministry of Defence route. So there was no in-person part of the process. It was done remotely. A couple of pre-interviews, pre-conversations, mainly because there is a real need for people that want to come and work here in any role, but especially in education, that they understand the context and also the context of living here, which is different. So a couple of pre-conversations, first interview, second interview, and then obviously a job offer.
And was there a moment when I think with any job, when you first get offered a job and you take it, you think, what have I done? Was this particularly in your case? You thought, goodness, I'm not just moving to Hounslow or somewhere, the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah, there is. I mean, the Falkland Islands government, I'm a direct employee of the Falkland Islands government in a way that is different, obviously, for most teachers in the English system now. I'm a civil servant for the government. There's a requirement to pass, I need a work permit to work here. And so, having to go through a process like that with some health, dental checks and a lot of paperwork to fill out, that immediately, made you realise this was a slightly different decision to move into Hounslow.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when people say the Falkland Islands, they think not only of the Falklands War, but how big it is. And it's far away and they look very small on the map, of course. And I'm going to say they're bigger than Wales. Is that at least twice the size of Wales?
I always, listen, you might be right. I've always told people it's about the size of Wales. It's it's a bigger landmass than I think probably people realise until they start looking in detail at the country. And then until you're here, I suppose. You have two main islands with lots of small islands. You have East and West Falkland. Obviously, the school is in Stanley. Stanley is a city. It was granted city status by the Queen, actually, in the Jubilee year. When you say a city, it's because it's got a cathedral. It's got a population of 3,500 people. The vast majority of people in the Falklands live on East Falkland in Stanley. And then you have outer settlements that are actually really quite small. Goose Green, perhaps, is the one that people of our age would know best from the conflict. And then West Falkland, which is across a body of water, sort of 2-hour ferry across to West Falkland, is just small settlements, remote farms and settlements on West Falkland. But both East and West Falkland, they're beautiful, very bleak sort of landscapes. I quite like that, but really beautiful in my opinion and very isolated. Probably the biggest realization is about how far away you are and the isolation. It always comes a few days after you land and you've had an 18-hour flight from RAF Brize Norton to RAF Mount Pleasant on the Falklands. It stops at Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic, halfway down. And you sort of come and you just see the vastness of the place with very few humans to see. And you can drive along a road and not see anyone outside of Stanley for miles and miles. And that's when it sort of hits you quite how far away you are.
Yes.
In a good way, I think.
Yeah, you're not in Kansas anymore, as you were. You've gone off the map and to a very different place. I looked at the website for your school and it does look beautiful, to be honest. I mean, some of the pictures that were associated with it, where the school was located and the landscape.
Yeah.
And I guess anyone listening to this might think, and the weather. It's the Southern Hemisphere. The weather severe?
No, not really. I think it's a very sort of popular opinion. I hear that opinion a lot. The weather must be really bad. And I think that does stem a little bit from the conflict, because obviously the conflict occurred during this period of time where we are at the moment, and sort of April, May through to June. And obviously the footage of the soldiers in the cold and the conditions, snow, are sort of etched in people's memory. But what I would say is that the Falklands can be windy, quite a constant wind, and a wind that actually is worse in the summer than it actually is in the winter. It's died down a bit now, and as we head towards our winter, it's a really dry, much drier than people realise. It's not damp like in the UK. Having said that, we are in a bit of an unprecedented wet spell at the moment, and it's raining today. Up until the last few weeks, you don't really experience those days and weeks of rain that you sometimes get in England. It's quite dry here, or it has been, up until the last couple of weeks of my time here. And then the temperature range, I would say, actually, I don't think it gets colder. It doesn't get as cold as sometimes it does in England in winter. But what it doesn't do is get as warm. So I think like the range of temperatures from the low temperatures to the high, it's much narrower here than it is in England. And then someone once said to me, Stanley, the Falklands, are no closer to the South Pole than London is to the North Pole. So although it looks really far south, and you can see Antarctica visible on a map of the Falklands a lot of the time, it's not as far south as you perhaps think.
There's something about the thought that there are penguins that means it.
Yeah,
means
totally.
it must be near ice floes and things.
No, not at all. No, never seen ice flow here.
So the population's about 3,000 of the whole Falkland Islands.
Population, I think is about 4,000 to 5,000.
4 to 5, right.
Stanley is around 3. There is a large British base, armed forces base at Mount Pleasant, and obviously that pushes the population up.
What's the range of, it's quite, again, looking at the pictures on your website, quite a diverse range of faces among the students. What's the background of most of your students?
So it's worth saying that the population of the Falklands is incredibly diverse. There are about 80 different nationalities on the latest census here. And obviously a school is always representative of society, and so that's represented in my school. And like you said, you can see that in the photographs of the school. The majority of my students have Falkland Islands status or permanent resident status here. Then obviously we also have children of people that are here working on contracts like I am. People that have come down and brought their families are obviously educated in the school. But the vast majority of the children in the school are from the Falkland Islands.
You're listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week, Sebastian St. John, head teacher of the Falkland Islands Community School. We're discussing school at the heart of the community.
And yours is an 11 to 16 school. And you said you were given a great deal of freedom. So you're free of the horrors of Ofsted breathing down your neck. And you're directly employed by the government of the Falkland Islands.
Yeah.
How did that manifest itself? And how much freedom were we talking about here? Were you able to come in and invent, or were you given a very strict instructions that you're the head of the school, but this is what we want from you?
I'm employed as a principal, but I have an executive head teacher who looks after both the primary school and the secondary school. You know, I do have a lot of freedom, but at the same time, have to be really mindful of the fact that, you know, I'm here for a period of time and then someone will follow me and then someone will potentially follow them. And so I think, you know, I've always taken the view of leadership that it needs to be sustainable, and obviously being a head in the UK, you've got to marry up the idea that you can't change everything versus the pressure of Ofsted potentially coming in and expecting you to have changed everything. Not being in that scenario here means that we can have a bit more of a sustainable plan. You know, we can really pick on the key things that we think need improving and work our way through them steadily, as opposed to trying to do everything at once. I don't think it's helpful to change everything at once and then someone 2, 3, 4 years down the line come in and do the same again. That's not what we're trying to do. So right. I have a lot of freedom. The school probably had a little bit of inconsistent leadership prior to me coming. So there's been an element of just coming in and trying to settle things down and build a bit more consistency. And then obviously begin to work on some of the key areas that we identified needed working on.
And what were those? I mean, was it like any school that had a few head teachers and things were changing? You say just needing to settle down. That might have been true in any school in this country. Was there something about the Falkland Islands situation that you said, these are particular things I've got to address?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things we identified quite early on was around literacy. Again, that's not that different in any English secondary school, but just a bit more of a coherent plan on how we were trying to raise literacy levels in the school. And there is a primary principal who had identified obviously similar issues at the primary school. She'd come before me, had been here about a year and a half when I arrived. So literacy was a key issue. Things pastorally, having a bit more of a pastoral structure to make sure that kids were safe and had people that they could speak to. Just rejigging the structure of the school to allow that. And also just staffing, ensuring that we were fully staffed, which we weren't when I arrived. And we worked pretty hard on since I've come here to ensure the school is fully staffed.
Yeah. And of course, you're in Stanley with its population of 3,000. So that's not small, but it is a small town in many ways. And people must know you're known. I taught many years ago, I did an exchange to Oregon, and it was a little town in Oregon with probably 10 or 15,000 population. But within a day or two, people said to me, you're the new teacher at the high school. And was that true with you, that you're very much part of a close-knit community where everyone knows everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that's one of the contextual things that I think it's really good, but also can be a challenge. So yeah, no, absolutely. People knew I was coming. People knew who I was even when I was on the plane on the way down. And, people knew who I was when I was in my first visits around the town. So yeah, no, that is absolutely a part of life here.
And did people have a view on the school and what should be done? And I found that in small town Oregon, everyone had a view on the school. It was a big part.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The way you don't find in a big city, the school is the school.
Everyone has a view on it, and that's not always helpful. It's a bit like, everyone has been to a school, therefore everyone thinks they're an expert in it. The difference here is that a lot of my parents have been to the school themselves, and now their children are coming. And so just some parents sometimes will carry their own experience and project that forward to how things are now, which obviously is part of the challenge of leading a school. Like I said at the start of the conversation, education is really valued in the islands, and the opportunities that children have educationally are fantastic, with what the government both funds on the islands, but also what the government funds for children post 16. And so people are invested in wanting their children to achieve.
Ever since the experience of the Falkland Islands War and so on, there's a decision that the Falkland Islands will thrive. The population should stay there. And so they're going to have good schools and so on. So things are funded.
The economies, there is full employment here. There are plenty of jobs. A lot of people in the community have several jobs because there's full employment. The big driver of the economy has been squid fishing over the last few years. But obviously tourism is a growing sector as well, which throughout the summer months, you have really large cruise ships coming into Stanley and sometimes putting 10 to 15,000 extra people just into Stanley for the day off a cruise ship. Talked about the size a number of times. It's quite an experience to see that amount of people, come into the city.
Yeah.
So the economy is doing really well. It is what allows generous funding for education. And there are other avenues for the government. For example, oil is potentially the next new introduction to the economy. So yeah, oil is something that will become a bigger part of the economy over the next few years, from what I know.
And you were saying most of your students, the majority of them, are Falkland Islanders. They were born on the island and so on. And do they view themselves as, this is where we're going to school here on the island, where my parents went, and we will make our lives on the island. So when they finish at 16, how do they view their future?
So I think the options that children have is that if they achieve a minimum set of grades at GCSE, they are entitled to a post-16 education overseas, primarily in England or in the UK. The government, we use a number of different schools. Chichester College, for example, is just one example of a school that we use. The offers widened actually from where pupils can go. So, for example, in last year's Year 11, there are some students that also went to New Zealand. But yeah, if they achieve a minimum requirements at 16, they continue their studies post 16 anywhere. And obviously the government pays for that, pays for their boarding, several points in the year. And then obviously at 18, if they again hit a minimum requirement, the government will fund their post-18 university education. So a massive advantage for obviously my own children in England is that children here can get a degree and even post-grad studies with absolutely zero debt because the government is incredibly generous in how it funds that.
Well, that must be really quite an incentive. I remember I was involved in education, and I remember students when as the story of debts increased, so students were more put off. You had to persuade them that university was a good idea with all its debt. So your students, they're very persuadable that university is a good idea. Well, going into sixth form is a good idea. So that must be quite an incentive.
Yeah, absolutely it is. But I would also say that the opportunities for children that choose not to go overseas are vast. We have a college here which oversees an apprenticeship program which presents really good opportunities for children that decide not to go overseas at 16. So yeah, that it's on all different levels. There is really good opportunities. We have children, for example, that want to work in agriculture and in farming. Their families maybe work in that industry, in that sector, and perhaps going overseas is not something that they want to do, and they can obviously explore opportunities in that area. But equally, we do have some children that go post 16 to ag colleges in England as well. So opportunities for the kids here is good.
And how many of them will leave the island because they'll go away if they go away at 16 and they come back and they go away at 18 to go to university? Of those that do that, will many stay abroad?
No, the vast majority. Yeah, the vast majority come back. And I would like to quote a figure, but I'm afraid, John, I'm not exactly certain how accurate my quoted figure would be, so I won't. But it's a really high percentage come back and make their life there.
So in many ways, the picture you're describing is very different to the one I imagined, really. It's a prosperous island. There's lots of opportunity for the kids. There's very good opportunities in education and so on. I was kind of imagining, I don't know why I had this image of sort of South Wales or somewhere where it was hard to find work and the old industries had gone completely, not a comparison at all. So what do you find the kind of student, you mentioned at the beginning that the issues and problems you had, the things that you thought you needed to address when you first came to school, one of them was literacy. Was that particular or just kids these days? Was that something with the Falkland Islands, or literacy was an issue?
No, literacy when I was a head in the UK was I worked in a wide ability secondary modern schools in Kent outside of the grammar system, and literacy was always a focus there. I think what we didn't necessarily have, and partly because of issues around the internet and stuff like that, was a really full picture of what the literacy levels were in the school. And so one of the things that we did is get onto GL assessment and start finding out what children's reading ages were, looking at how many children in the school had a reading age below a secondary level, and then picking off those children that we could make the biggest improvements, with the aim ultimately of trying to get our children to read at their chronological age, I suppose, is our ultimate aim. If I'm honest with you, that was as much an issue as in the UK. But yeah, it was the thing that jumped out at me when I came here that also needed to be looked at.
Was there a particular problem in your school or issue with, you mentioned that you're staying for a contracted period, you're probably not going to make your life in the Falkland Islands, and previous heads had been the same. Is that true of some of the teachers as well? Is there a feeling among the students and so on that he's the latest guy, and this lack of continuity is a problem for the school in a sense?
Yeah, I think it is a problem. Using the term problem is perhaps, it's not a problem. It's an issue that people need to be aware of, which is why I said about making sustainable change, not throwing everything up in the air because you're the new person that's come in, and not letting your ego drive decisions. You may see 50 things that you want to change, but actually be realistic about what you can change, do the things that are going to have the biggest impact, and not having Ofsted allows you to make those sorts of decisions. The reality obviously is that I think the community would like teachers to stay for longer, and some do. We've got a number of teachers that have staying beyond their contracted term. It's possible to stay beyond the contract and to move on to local terms, and more of them are. But equally, if someone decides not to, it's not too different from in the UK. There are huge opportunities for teachers in the UK now, and if you're ambitious You can move on to new opportunities quite regularly. I know I've spent in my career a long time in a school, but I've worked with people who have been brilliant, but have moved on every 3 or 4 years from one job to another. And that is part of what the teaching profession is. I think that's something that is happening a bit more in the teaching profession, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we needed to think about here is obviously just making sure that there's really clear rationale for the change that we want to make, so that when the next person comes in, there's a really clear sort of trajectory of what we're trying to achieve. Having an executive principal that's involved in those decisions, that knows what I've been trying to do, then feeds into when the next person comes in. There's more of a flow, I suppose, is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Using the word problem, it could equally be a great advantage to have people coming in, like, picking up and bringing new ideas, new enthusiasm, and so on. Absolutely. When you're in a school in this country these days, one of the things that are going to be in front of your eyes is going to be the safety of the students. They've got fences around the school that are a commonplace these days. Outside the school, you have to be careful of traffic and so on. I'm just going to guess that the Falkland Islands is a very safe environment. I noticed from your website that students aren't wearing uniforms. Is there a feeling that you have opportunities to explore the island, to use the outdoors in a way that wouldn't be true in many schools, even in rural areas in this country?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. A number of curriculum areas, real strength in taking children outside of school. We still have an EVC, we still have risk assessments and things like that. But yeah, I think children do get out of school a bit more, and we're able to use the local environment. The government is a large organisation, and the environmental department has some really interesting sections. Science is also a big employment sector. In Stanley, we have British Antarctic Survey based here, which is the South Atlantic Scientific Research Group. So the opportunities for really specialised people doing some interesting and cool stuff to come in and speak to the kids and support them. Yes, there is a huge opportunity. And just picking up your point around safeguarding, I think this is an attractive place to bring children up. It is incredibly safe. You know, children walk to school far more than they now do in the UK.
Yeah.
You know, there is less traffic on the roads. You see children playing outside a lot more than potentially you do in England in some areas. But obviously what that does is create a different context. You know, we don't have a uniform in school. We absolutely don't have a fence around the school. The context of safeguarding is different in relation to some of those things that if you didn't have in a UK setting, you would, you know, Ofsted would come in ultimately and say that your safeguarding was inadequate, you don't have a fence around the school, etc. It is very different here. It is a good example of how the school is. Similar to an English school, we broadly follow the English national curriculum. We offer a mix of UK GCSEs and IGCSEs and some level 1 qualifications and various things like that, but it is still a different context. And yeah, the uniforms and the, you know, magnetic locks and on gates and all that.
Buzz them in, buzz them out kind of thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely not something that exists here.
And as I contemplate for a moment the image you've just created there, Seb, of schools without uniforms and fences and buzzing in and security and so on, I think it's rather a good time to take a break for the Teachers Talk Radio news. Join us again in a few minutes with my guest, Sebastian St. John, head teacher of the Falkland Islands Community School. After the news.
Imagine having your own instructional coach available 24/7. Now you can with the Teaching How-Tos platform. This highly personalised social platform empowers busy teachers to learn and apply evidence-based teaching techniques, either independently, working collaboratively with their peers, or with our new AI assistant. The platform features over 160 visual guides to teaching techniques, designed to help you quickly and easily implement high-impact practices that boost student engagement and improve learning outcomes. Join over 200 institutions worldwide that are elevating their teaching practices with the How To app. No gurus, just practical support anytime you need it. Interested in finding out more? Visit teachinghowtos.com and register for our next webinar.
Empowering education with Easy for You, where innovation meets accessibility. Our subscription-based offering not only equips schools with cutting-edge devices, but revolutionizes the learning experience by eliminating financial barriers, streamlining support, and embracing technology. We're not just providing tools, we're shaping a future where every student can thrive, unburdened by limitations. Easy for You, transforming education, one device at a time. Find out more at www.easyforyou.school.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Hi teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculum. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps for good. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
A lack of maintenance support is creating a two-tier higher education system, says a report in The Guardian. More than half of full-time students are working long hours in jobs to support themselves at university, according to a survey of UK undergraduates conducted by the Higher Education Policy Institute. The survey of 10,000 students found a record 56% had paid employment and were working an average of 14.5 hours per week. Experts said the lack of maintenance support was widening the divide between students who need to work to survive and their better-off peers who are free to concentrate on their studies. When combined with time spent attending lectures, classes and other study, students with part-time jobs are averaging a 48-hour working week, with some completing a 56-hour working week during term time. The average working time for adults in full-time jobs, according to the ONS, is just 36.6 hours per week. Higher Education Policy Institute's Rose Stevenson said the traditional model of higher education, with undergraduates studying full-time away from home, was becoming unattainable, and maintenance support would need to improve in order to support students with the cost of living. According to research, the cost of living crisis abruptly flipped the proportion of students mixing paid employment and full-time study. Before 2021, roughly 2/3 of students had no paid employment in term time. But this year, 56% of students said they had paid employment and were working longer hours than students in previous years. 3/4 said this was to meet their living costs, whilst 23% said it was to give financial support to families. 80% of students who had been in care were working in part-time jobs. The research also explored how working students completed their studies, with more being likely to use artificial intelligence programs and were more likely to view lectures online. Further details of the study and an additional report by the National Union of Students can be found online via the Guardian website. Money is also a feature in an article by Schools Week. It focuses on a response to a Conservative pledge to protect pupil funding in real terms. According to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, This could lead to the biggest school budget reduction for 50 years. The Conservative manifesto contains a promise to protect day-to-day school spending in real terms per pupil, but the IFS said this would work out as a £3.5 billion cut. This is because pupil numbers are due to fall by 400,000 by 2028. Meanwhile, Labour launched its manifesto with many media outlets covering its pledges on education. The National Education Union General Secretary welcomed the party's commitment to education, but said the proposals contained no indication that education cuts would be reversed. The NEU also expressed concern that Labour's pledge to recruit 6,500 teachers does not go far enough. The NASUWT union also commented on the recruitment pledge, saying it must go hand in hand with tackling the cause of the teacher retention crisis. Manifestos for all parties who have published them are available online. Away from the election, the BBC reports on an experiment undertaken by 10 teenagers from Salford. The teens swapped their smartphones for basic devices that could only make calls or send texts for a period of 5 days. The detox was run as part of a BBC project looking at the smartphone habits of young people. The report covers the positive impact the detox has, as well as the negatives. One of the participants dropped out after just 27 hours because not being online was really stressful. Some, however, found it liberating, as well as helping with sleep and engaging more with friends and family. Full details of the experiment and the responses of participants can be found on the BBC News website. Finally, as a follow-up on a story previously reported on Teachers Talk Radio News, Teesside University has announced it will help fund flights for Nigerian students hit by financial difficulties. Students from Nigeria were thrown off courses and ordered to leave the UK after a currency crisis left them struggling to pay tuition fees. The BBC Tees News website covered events and subsequent protests about the way students had been treated. This resulted in some intervention from the Nigerian government, but Teesside University has also told the BBC that it has re-enrolled some affected students and opened a travel fund, with a spokesperson saying, "We are working with a small group who do need to return to their home country and are opening an international relief fund to offer additional financial support for those unexpected travel costs." Some students have been told they can complete their studies from Nigeria or return to the UK at a later date to complete. Full details of the story can be found on the BBC News website, Teesside section. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News from Joe Fox.
So, Seb, one of the things I was thinking about that I haven't asked you yet is about the theme of my show is what schools are for. And all schools are for multiple things. And you say literacy, preparing people for work, and we talked about that a bit. But there's also the sort of building of a sense of who you are. Who do Falkland Island children think they are? And does the school involved in this sort of sense of being a Falkland Islander, being someone that's just off the coast of South America, or being British? Is that an issue, or is that just not something that comes up?
No, I think I would say that people here are rightly proud of their country, and a lot of the children that the Falklands send are representatives of the Commonwealth Games every time it comes around, and also the Island Games, which is for small island nations, and some of our pupils are in those teams, so get to represent the country where they live, so they're very proud of that. We also send football teams, and hockey is a big sport here, as in inline hockey, not field hockey. And we send a team every year overseas sometimes to Punta in the south of Chile, or even to Miami. In my time here, that the children have been to represent the Falklands in ice hockey. So yeah, there is a real strong sense. And like I said, that we teach Falklands history as part of our Key Stage 3 curriculum. So the children are aware. We have an annual competition that pupils both at the primary and the secondary school complete, which is the Alistair and Jane Cameron project, which is about Falkland history. We also have an annual art exhibition called Susan Whitley exhibition. Susan Whitley was an art teacher originally from the UK that came down to teach, and was actually one of the civilian victims during the Falklands conflict. So we have an annual art exhibition competition that all children in both schools participate in, which is a really big part of the community. So no, the children are really aware of their history. They're really aware of the country that they live in, and they're really proud of it, which is.
But Falkland, as you say, the Falkland Islands got this moment almost of the long past of the Falkland Islands, but there's also this moment when it sort of begins again from the Falkland Islands War. So students are aware of that as a sort of inheritance in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think quite rightly that, their awareness goes back beyond 1982 as well, which it should do, and families know and can trace their line back really clearly, even to some of the British people to come and help form Stanley. The capital of the Falklands was elsewhere at first, and Stanley became a capital a bit later. People are aware of it and proud of it.
And you mentioned that some students will go and study in New Zealand. It's very much a Southern Hemisphere. And it strikes me that hockey and that sporting sort of environment is very South American or Southern Hemisphere sort of thing. In a good relationship with Chile, how do your students feel about, and indeed, how do the Falkland Islands feel about Argentina, which is the nearest neighbour?
I don't know. It's difficult. We have Argentine visitors to the islands. We have visitors at the moment from Argentina because obviously it's the anniversary of the conflict for them as well. I think Argentines are welcomed here if they choose to come. But I think, we live in a tolerant society here. People are tolerant and understanding. But obviously a lot of people also have raw memories of what happened in 1982. And the people and families here, parents and grandparents, were ultimately occupied and lived under occupation. So that's also in the forefront of their mind. It's a difficult one to answer, John, that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because in a sense, there's Argentina is not that far away. What is it? It's 100 and something miles away. It's not a place that Falklands will identify as a place regularly going to, cultural links with, somewhere you regularly visit, or any kind of regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, there is a monthly LATAM flight that flies from Punta Arenas in southern tip of Chile. And most people then go on to Santiago from that, and that flies in and out on a Saturday. Once a month, that flight does also land in Argentina. So there is the opportunity if people want to visit and make those cultural links there. I think ultimately, I said a bit earlier, people here are really tolerant and understanding, and this is an open society. But I suppose that the relationship with Argentina is made more complicated because of the fact that there obviously is this continual claim, and there's a lot of rhetoric from Argentine politicians, and aspects of life here can be made difficult by control of airspace and stuff like that. And so it's not unreasonable perhaps for people to wish things were slightly different, because 2012 a referendum showed that over 99% of people living in the Falklands wish the country to remain British, and also the UN recognises the rights of the population of the country for self-determination.
Literally, yeah.
And it's very clear in the minds of the people here of what this country is and how they identify themselves, but if constantly being told elsewhere that that's not how they should feel, or that's not the case, I suppose that does create issues.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, really, is that sense in which there is both a sense of history, a sense of identity that is defined by that war, that threat, but it's also still there. There's Argentina, not that far away, that every now and again a change of government or a part of the rhetoric of being an Argentinian politician is to say, and of course, we don't relinquish our claim to the Falkland Islands or Malvinas.
You're listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week, Sebastian St. John, head teacher of the Falkland Islands Community School. We're discussing school at the heart of the community.
We talked about being in a small town, the sense that everyone knows everybody. Of course, if you're in this country, even in the rural areas of this country, you're not far away from a theatre. we're far away from an art gallery. There's all those enrichment sort of things that, the Antarctic survey and such like, which must be wonderful to have on your doorstep, that kind of cutting edge science and so on. How do you give these students the kind of access to a broader culture that might not be there? Or is it there on the island?
Oh, I mean, culturally, there's plenty of opportunities for children to access. Granted, it's not like teaching in England where you're 30 minutes away from the centre of London, and obviously the cultural opportunities that exist, that clearly exist. But culturally, the islands are alive, and there's a rich cultural offer for children to access. Art is talked about. Susan Whitley art exhibition. Art is a really important part of Falklands culture, and there are incredibly talented artists that live and work in the Falklands. So, yeah, I mean, culturally, there's so much for children to do. But, perhaps they don't have the smartphone access, for example, that an English student might get. But who would claim that that's necessarily a bad thing? I mean, certain restrictions or slow speed of internet does cause, the internet can be both a fantastic thing, but I think most people who work in schools also know what an absolute pain it can be, and not a good thing, and leads to all sorts of issues. It's just not an issue here.
I was taking a very sort of metropolitan view there, wasn't I? That, if you can't go off to the theatre and the art gallery, then what is there? And as you're saying, there's a rich cultural life, but it's just different.
Yeah, there is just, for example, just like camp life. So we refer to anywhere that's outside of Stanley as camp. I think it originally comes from like Spanish, campo, countryside. Camp life is incredibly rich. It's a really distinctive Falkland Islands cultural sort of element. There's that sort of cultural offer. But, we have a cinema here. We can go to the cinema. We get British television. We get British radio stations. Amdram, the sporting offer that I mentioned before about kids being able to compete internationally at sporting events is, and again, that all feeds, I suppose, into that sort of cultural offer. You asked earlier about what we do in school. One of the things we have looked at is PSHE and educating children and trying to develop them the whole person. I would say we are able to do that here because of perhaps the relaxation that we have around chasing performance measures, which sometimes limit an individual child's development for the sake of what a government says the child should do. And, we don't need to do that. We're not chasing progress 8 scores. We clearly want to make sure children leave school with choice because they've got qualifications to go overseas to study if they need to. But we can look at the whole child, and we've reintroduced the Duke of Edinburgh International Award Scheme. So we've reintroduced into the school in the last 12 months. Yeah, so no, we offer the Duke of Edinburgh International Award. We reintroduced that bronze, but we'll be doing silver. So children at 16 can leave with both bronze and silver.
When you were talking there, I was thinking about a guest I had a while ago who was a Finnish teacher in Finland, and another teacher I was talking to, not on Teachers Talk Radio, who come from Iceland. The way in which Finland and Iceland could be seen as a bit parochial, but they were describing exactly the sort of what you're describing, a very rich, not only sense of identity, but cultural environment as well, in which it was very participatory sort of culture. Is there a sort of folk element, folk culture, as you said, rural culture in Falklands that students enjoy?
So I think that does tie into what I was talking about, culture, the identity of life in camp, and over Christmas in our summer, shearing competitions. We send shearers around the world to the World Shearing Championships because sheep is a big part of our agricultural life here. So that identity, shearing and stuff like that. Children here who are out in camp, and many go out into camp, a real sort of, they drive 4x4 vehicles off road here. Where we live in Stanley, we're surrounded by countryside. It's common land. Children ride bikes, quad bikes, and even 4x4s in their spare time. And, I managed to do that in a perfectly safe way, in a way that you wouldn't see in the UK. I mean, it wouldn't be allowed in the UK, but different. They are Falkland Islanders first. They are also British, but they are Falkland Islanders first, and the culture is different.
I noticed when I was looking at your website, I was confused by the term camp. Now I get that. It's sort of outside of Stanley, the countryside.
I have students at the secondary school who are children that live out in settlements, some of them really remote, who ultimately board at Stanley House, which is the education department's boarding facility for camp children. Up until year 5 and 6, they're educated in settlement schools, camp schools, sometimes even within the farm buildings out in camp. During year 5 and 6, they transition into town and move into Stanley House, so that by the time they start year 7, they're settled in the boarding house. Some of those children will go home only every half term and will spend their time in the boarding house because of the remoteness with where they are. They won't travel back every weekend.
Well, yes, I saw that. I saw also some of the pictures of some of the little schools, really just no more than a tiny building and so on. Yes, it sounds very frontier, and it sounds very wonderful, actually. Sounds very nice.
Yeah, frontier, perhaps I've not heard that expression before, but yeah, I suppose there isn't. Yeah, definitely.
I was thinking of the little house on the prairie, that the one-room schoolroom kind of experience.
We have a mixture of ages of children there. That is what happens.
I mean, you painted a very attractive picture of the Falkland Islands experience, and your time there is coming to an end. And when you do come back to this country, I mean, it's going to be a bit of a culture shock, I would imagine. But also, what would you bring with you? I could sort of guess what you bring with you, some of the obsession with results and achievement and monitoring and data.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've always tried as a head and a principal in the UK to try and ensure that progress in the school, that school improvement was always viewed through the eyes of trying to make sure it's sustainable and try and distribute leadership as much as possible across the team and middle leaders as well, because I think that really is the only true way that you can improve a school, as opposed to someone coming in and saying, this is how we do it because I know best. But the problem is when you're ahead in the UK, as you probably know, you have to marry that against an inspection framework and the continual cycle of inspections. And so, it's relentless. If you get that pace of change wrong in a school, you're trying to basically move the school forward, but you're trying to do it in a sustainable way without burning your staff out. You can fall foul of an Ofsted inspection and you're out of a job. That being here hasn't really changed my view about school improvement, but I suppose it's allowed me to do it without that immediacy of being concerned about Ofsted. And I actually believe that there should be an inspectorate. I'm not an anti-Ofsted school leader at all, but I can tell you, I have definitely not missed that Sunday afternoon dread. And then every morning, Monday to Wednesday up to lunch, being concerned about getting a phone call. Even when you've known actually then again, it will be a good thing because actually you've done everything and it's going to be positive. It still is that element of us. What else will I bring? I was never, if I'm honest with you, I've always enjoyed the nature and being out in the open, but I've appreciated it even more here because it is just on your doorstep. There is nothing better, I would say, than being able to leave school. As I was saying to you off air, that we have an hour's shut down every day, so it's not a snatched sandwich from the canteen for any of my staff. We have a full hour off school. There's no children. People can go home if they want to. Working in the school here can sometimes be a challenge. That's what makes it an attractive job. It's different and sometimes it is challenging, but there's nothing better than leaving school at midday and driving 5 minutes and seeing penguins on the beach. That's really cool. And that's something that I will miss. Yes. Because I'm definitely not going to get that in England.
Well, Seb, that is a brilliant image to end on. And thank you so much for joining me on Teachers Talk Radio for this. And I've really enjoyed our discussion. I think someone who's able to go outside of the profession and look back on it, I think is very, very refreshing and will be very interesting to our listeners. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. No problem.
And that brings to an end this episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs here on Teachers Talk Radio. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. My guest this week was Sebastian St. John, head teacher of the Falkland Islands Community School. I think I'll carry a number of things away from this talk, this discussion, and Sebastian's description of life on the Falkland Islands. It may be that what stands out for me are some of the things that are absent from life as a head teacher, as a pupil, and as a teacher on the Falkland Islands. No uniforms, no fences around the school. A school surrounded by open common land where students wander freely home for lunch. No progress 8, no Ofsted, no high stakes inspections. And students, who if they're successful, will have a place with no fees and no debts to study agriculture, to train, or to go on to university. Doesn't seem all that bad to me. If you want to hear this discussion again, you can find it on Spotify or on the Teachers Talk Radio website. Join me again in 2 weeks' time as I continue to explore what schools are for. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.